A report developed by sex workers in Vancouver, BC is bringing awareness to the unique challenges they face. Developed by the Metro Vancouver Consortium, the By Us, For Us research project surveyed more than 200 sex workers in the area. It found that 45% of those surveyed were Indigenous, and over a quarter of that group identified as Two-Spirit. The report noted Indigenous sex workers are disproportionately involved in street-level work, making them more prone to violence and harm. While it is legal to sell sex in Canada, buying and advertising the work is not. It calls for decriminalization so that, quote, sex workers could more easily access resources that prevent and respond to harm. And Mebrat Beyene is the executive director of the Wish Drop-In Center Society, one of the organizations involved, and she joins me now. Mebrat, thank you so much for taking some time for us today. Why was it important to have the report prepared with the input of sex workers?
Yeah, thanks, Daryl, and thanks so much for your interest in the report. The reason for that is that there's just so much out there that is either deeply stigmatized about sex workers, or that sex workers themselves rarely get to speak to directly, and not filtered by non-sex workers or by advocacy organizations. So this is really significant that it was directed by sex workers, and that it is directly the voices of sex workers themselves.
So is that what makes this report unique then to others that may be out there?
It's one of the reasons that makes it really unique. The other reason is that, for those of us that support sex workers or that work alongside sex workers, there's such little data and information out there, period. And so trying to back up all of the anecdotal information and all that we know and that we hear from sex workers directly, and to actually have it confirmed without a shadow of a doubt, is really significant. The other reason that this is significant is that it's also the largest of its kind that we've been able to pull off, or that our colleagues have been able to pull off. We found all through COVID that as we were trying to raise the flag and raise the alarm about what was happening for sex workers, it was so difficult to consistently maintain that attention because there's not enough data out there.
Right. And Mebrat, for you, what were the most surprising findings from this?
I would say how high some of the numbers were. So none of the areas were surprising, but how significant they were was certainly surprising. So for example, the number of sex workers that identified as living with disabilities was much higher than any of us had anticipated or fully understood. And same thing in terms of housing precarity. Same thing for really basic, and I'm just sort of cherry picking here because there's just so much richness in the report, but same thing for really basic access to services, including safe and clean washrooms. So, what we saw was definitely a clear picture of where the risks are, where the potentials for exploitation are, and the last piece, which again isn't so much a surprise, but certainly the level of fear and concern around personal safety. Okay. We've always known to be really high, but this study absolutely confirms it. And the number of people naming things like food precarity and hunger as one of the pressure points was so much higher than we thought.
Well, how are Indigenous women affected?
Yeah, so in this study, 45% of the respondents were Indigenous, and I think there's a number of layers here. There's a number of layers of invisibility that Indigenous sex workers face, and additional scrutiny and additional stigma that Indigenous sex workers face. So there are a number of people who are trading sex in one way or another, and some of them may not be out as identified sex workers because of the level of stigma. And for Indigenous sex workers, I think there's additional levels of stigma, discrimination, racism, predatory behavior that aligns with a lot of the calls to action that all of us stand in solidarity with around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so much of this study also centers around gender and race. So we know what that looks like. We know what it looks like when those identities intersect, and when they intersect in the body of somebody who is trading sex. So I would say for black sex workers, for indigenous sex workers, and for sex workers who are gender diverse, and a lot of times that might all be one person, that definitely has a disproportionately higher amount of precarity or potential risk of exploitation.
And last question for you here, Mebrat. What do you hope will come from this?
That's a great question. I would hope that there is renewed focus, that there's increased focus, not even renewed, but increased focus on the issues facing a diversity of sex workers, that there is significant attention paid to the resources necessary to support sex workers, that there is a new focus on the calls to action, including at a federal level decriminalizing the legislation and decriminalizing sex work, and to pay attention to the calls to action and recommendations in this report, because they speak directly to sex workers' rights, which are human rights, and they align with so many other calls to action around poverty reduction, health and safety, gender-based violence, the right to work safely, the ability to turn down unsafe work. All of these come together in this report and in terms of what sex workers are telling us, and it's high time that we pay attention.
Well, Mebrat, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for coming on and providing some insight for us.
Thanks, Daryl.